Good afternoon. I am so thrilled to invite Jackie and Michelle to the table. Both of them are fabulous librarians in high school libraries, in public schools in Connecticut. And one of the really interesting and important issues of the day right now for me is the territory of news literacy. And as a former social studies teacher, it's something that I very much paid attention to, but it was a different time and space in the late 90s and early 2000s when I was teaching. And right now, I think news literacy is so vitally important as we're trying to grow students that actually can think hard about what the 24-hour news cycle in front of them is and how to meaningfully engage with information as opposed to being somebody that passes along misinformation and potentially incendiary ideas. So first of all, Jackie, Michelle, thanks so much for taking a little bit of time with me on a late afternoon, and welcome.
Thanks, Allison.
So one of the things that I want to get started with you on is, who did you write this book for? What was your target audience, and what was your compelling purpose or why this book was so vitally important to you?
Well, originally we were approached to write this book thinking of librarians, but I think that, Jackie, do you want to expand on that?
Sure. I think that, once we really started to get into the thick of the writing, it became really clear that was a limited view, because the issue of news literacy is a societal issue. It's not even just an educational issue or just a library issue. And so we began to think more broadly about how people could kind of hone their skills when it came to unpacking digital media and news media that they were receiving. And so the focus became broader the more writing we were doing.
And I just want to be clear right out of the gate for anybody that is thinking about purchasing news literacy. This is not just what news literacy is and why it matters. There is sort of a strong early emphasis on that, but it immediately goes into actionable examples, not just for librarians, but potentially for any educator in any subject area across the grade level spans. So I want to go into one concrete example that I thought was incredibly helpful and meaningful. Let's start with what bibliographies reveal. So Michelle, can you talk a little bit about the sort of the inspiration behind that assignment and how that works?
Okay, well, there were a couple of things that led us, and this happened with Jackie. We work in different schools now, but we worked in the same school at the time, and it really came from necessity. So we had explored, and that we had worked always with citation generators tools, and we, after the new guidelines on MLA 8 came out, that none of that was working. So we really needed to have students create their own bibliographies from scratch. And so we did an exit ticket at that point very shortly that year. And in the exit ticket, students really voiced that they didn't understand the value of a bibliography. They wanted to know the parts. They knew how to fix it if we told them how, but they didn't really know how to fix it from scratch. So they started to create their bibliographies from scratch, and we started grading a whole lot more of them. And I have to say that this brought to my attention as a librarian that I had basically failed on this one thing all the way through, because the more I looked at, the more I realized, wait a minute, this is more than a bibliography. This is so much more of an insight into what the student is doing in the research process and how they're evolving through the research process. So literally in the faculty meeting that I just came from, I had a discussion with one of the teachers I'll be working with tomorrow, and we had a conversation about this. I said, I just graded, 100 sophomore bibliographies, and realized that the kids are using teacher notes, teacher websites, lesson plan websites, student work, and clickbait more than they are using, and news sources to document information that really, that's not what they should be using clearly for this kind of research. So we're finding problems in their research process. And they're not digging deep enough. So they'll stay, sort of at that wonder phase of the research and the reference phase, and they'll never dig deeper. Or they're digging into materials, they're citing materials that are not reflected because they're not able to reference them adequately in their sources. So it's really sort of it's a snapshot overview of what kind of research they're doing. And I think that's really been illuminating for me as a librarian, and it's really prompted me to find a whole series of strategies to teach students to be independent in creating bibliographies, because the more independent they are, the easier they are to grade and the more I can grade. So that we have this really great system set up at the high school.
Yeah, and in a nutshell, the student question is, why can't I just give you the URL? They live in an online research kind of world, and they want to copy and paste a URL and say, I've shown you my source, so I'm honoring the person who created the work. But it's in the creating of the citation that they're asked to really dig into how substantive is that source. And when they are looking for information to build a citation and they can't find that information, that then can start to throw up red flags for them about whether or not the source is one that they actually should be basing an argument on.
Yeah, so it's fascinating too, because when you're using, Jackie, the word substantive, I think that's really at the core of news literacy. So talk a little bit more, Jackie and Michelle, on what is it that you're hoping for in relation to students becoming more thoughtful examiners of information?
Well, as a former social studies teacher also, I find that the news literacy conversation that we're having is it's an iteration of earlier versions of a similar conversation. Historians have fielded these accusations of being revisionist historians as they challenge a traditionally accepted narrative of history. And women's historians have argued that what they're doing is refocusing the lens that has been applied to history. And that lens has had a very narrow focus traditionally, and lots of other people have been in the scene, but the way the picture was focused, they've been cropped out. And so a refocusing of that lens includes more people in the story. And really, in a news literacy sense, that's what we're asking of people. I think that's the big call to action. It's to become aware of how narrow your lens has become focused, and what are you not letting in because of that narrow focus, and how do you broaden it? How do you fool the algorithms of search so they stop sending you more of what you've already indicated you like, or you sending you you don't want, so that you can be a wholly informed person.
Well, go ahead, Michelle.
I think when I think about Common Core, and particularly the research part of it, the inquiry part of Common Core, I think it gels down to three things. You need kids to be able to ask good questions, to really question everything, to read really well.
Yeah.
Read closely, and then to be able to produce content that is worthy of publication. So that close reading piece, I think, is the weakest link, frankly. Kids are eager to produce content. Kids, by nature, ask questions. They don't necessarily ask good questions. That's our job. But the middle piece is really hard.
Yeah.
And especially they tend to find information. They print information or capture information and curate information. The reading piece is really hard, and reading well is different from reading. And so I think that for me, we basically took our pool of lessons in this book and we put them together. And I think that for me, that was always the driving force, was how well are they reading? Are they really understanding this language? What is the difference between using the word white nationalism to racist comments. I want to know how they're interpreting these messages differently, and are they being critical about those distinctions? And it's one thing when they're looking at things in comparative, it's side by side. It's another thing when they're looking at things in isolation, because it's much harder to see the distinctions. So many of the lessons we offer in the book are really, let's compare these different texts and see how they differ in their language. But I think that it's even harder when you remove them from the lesson, because they don't have that experience where they're actually forced to compare.
And I want to give my learning personalized community members a warning. It probably took me twice as long to read the news literacy book, because I kept coming across like such fascinating URL links that you put in there that I went down a rabbit hole. So I went into the Rebranding America, and then I was clicking on Chrysler and M&M. I'm like, oh my gosh, that's such a fantastic project. And then all sides, I don't know where that was for my entire teaching life. But again, to start to think about not just sort of the importance of the idea around news literacy and the intentionality of how you describe certain lessons, but at the same time, really starting to go after what you're just talking about now, Michelle, is that oftentimes we rush too much. And again, this is true for adults too. We rush too much to finish, as opposed to taking a moment, taking a deep breath, and really diving into an examination. So how often, again, not calling any of the three of us out, but how often do people potentially put a like next to a source that they never read, but they do like the person who sent it along to them? So that level of activism without examining content is something potentially some of us or many of us may be guilty of.
Well, and I think, Allison, you also raised an interesting point, something that happened to you with print that probably happens to most people when they're reading online, right? But it's the almighty hyperlink. And take the almighty hyperlink and add the infographic and the embedded video and all of the other forms that content can take, blend that together in one package, and none of us have the same reading experience as one another, because we own the reading experience much more than the author or the content creator owns it, because we've been provided all of these avenues. And so there's the issue of reading completely and reading well, but we don't read in a linear way. We don't, A to B to C is not how we all navigate our news literacy world anymore.
Yeah, Jackie, and again, that was such an important point that you made in the book in terms of reimagining what we're teaching them around reading in a digitally literate world. And I actually purchased the book on Kindle, so it was incredibly easy to sort of launch into my sort of various rabbit holes. And again, you're absolutely right. It changed the experience depending on what rabbit hole I decided to go down. So it's an incredibly important point. I want to move into another concrete example that you share in the text, and you designed a lesson around it, is the hashtag example. So can you describe a little bit about the intent of that hashtag lesson or activity that you were after, why you designed it, and what you hope it continues to reveal for kiddos?
So that hashtag lesson was really inspired by the SNL skit. I don't know if you've seen it, where they keep talking in hashtags through the whole skit, and it's funny because of the elements of truth in it. And so the idea that a hashtag thread can bring together people from very disparate experiences, because that hashtag resonates with them for a particular reason. And so, if you take a large issue, anything, you can pull anything out of current events or anything out of trends in education, and then look at what are the different ways in which people are talking about this issue and the various nuances and emanations of it, just as Michelle was talking earlier about comparing headlines from different news sources. Hashtags do the same thing. And depending on the hashtag that you follow, you're getting a certain version of events. And one group or one interest group will create a hashtag in order to kind of galvanize their movement or bring people to their conversation. And then another movement will create a reactionary hashtag. So in the same way that you have to compare your news sources to the way you participate in these threaded dialogues that are online.
And I think that's also a part of news literacy, but just media literacy, is to really teach students how to be fluent in the language of different social media platforms. So so in Twitter in particular, just being able to read a shortened URL and to try to infer information from that, and to use the hashtags, and also to look at the ways words are truncated, and to be able to be versatile in that. That's one of the things that came up out of the Stanford History Education Group executive summary from the fall of 2016, was that even college students about whom we might have some expectations about their fluency in Twitter, it turns out are not at all, they don't dig deep enough. So they'll take at face value a 140 character statement rather than digging into see the source of the statement and clicking on the link. So that was problematic in that study. And I think that that's something that we should be mindful of in moving forward with our information literacy and news literacy.
So the last question that I want to talk through with you is, you made a statement somewhere in the text that news literate citizens have certain dispositions or behaviors. And so based on my longstanding work and friendship with Ben Akalik, I would love to dive into, in the world of work that you're engaged with students, what are the handful of behaviors or dispositions that you believe are so fundamentally important, especially through the lens of what you said, Michelle, earlier around the heart of what research is after: asking good questions, examining close texts, and being able to publish something of value?
I think that there's a tremendous connection between people's news literacy and their emotional intelligence. When working with students this year, I've been talking with them about when you encounter a headline that makes you gasp, or makes you raise your shoulders, or makes you grab the hand of the person next to you, or gives you that impulse to like or dislike or share or repost, that the thing that they have to realize is that when we start to have an emotional reaction to something, our critical thought is suppressed as our emotions become inflamed.
Yes.
And that's what purveyors of misinformation and disinformation are going for.
Yes.
They know that about us, and they count on our lack of self-awareness. And so that is the biggest issue, I think, that we really tackle, is people being able to read their own, not just their intellectual or their cognitive responses to the media they're encountering, but to read their emotional and their visceral responses, and realize how those two things can be at odds with one another when it comes to their critical understanding.
Lovely.
Back in September, I was listening to On the Media, which is one of my favorite NPR programs, and Brooke Gladstone I don't even remember who she was interviewing, but she said, confirmation bias has nothing to do with thinking and everything to do with feeling. And I think that's such an important quote, and I think that's where we're starting to misuse news. Yeah. Is it's not about information, it's about confirming, like basically validating our own feelings, and those are two very different experiences.
Yeah. And I think, again, so many of the rich lessons and examples that you have in news literacy is really trying to peel back the onion a bit. And I think that the final part that I would love for you to end the interview on is really about perspective taking, and the concern that you're seeing, not only in your students, but in the communities around you, of deliberately being exposed to multiple diverse sources of information as opposed to information that you're only curating from one place, whether it's Comedy Central, CNN, Fox News, what have you.
So I think that the algorithms of search play a big role in that, right? And being aware of how that works. I do a little personal through my news feed, and am I getting a lot of tech stories, and am I getting a lot of stories about the new Google phone, and have I stopped getting stories about other issues? And I consciously then do news searches where I can click on the stories that I'm not seeing, so that I'm putting back into those algorithms information that I want to be receiving these things. And it's a hard thing to want to receive things that you might disagree with, but in order to be able to understand the world the way other people besides me and the people who pat me on the back and say, yes, Jackie, go Jackie, you're right on, right? I have to see the world the way other people see the world. I have to accept that discomfort in order to become more than our interactions, but it's also in our online behavior and our patterns of clicking.
Michelle, you have the last word.
Oh, I was just thinking, and just to follow up on what Jackie's saying, it would be a great lesson, because it's not like we put those lessons in a book and then we stopped. We're still teaching. So we're constantly thinking of new ways to do this, and we're working very closely with the ninth graders, and I'm starting to think about ways to do this. But I would love to do a filter bubble experiment. So taking Eli Pariser's filter bubble concept and asking students to use Chrome profiles to see how their feed changes depending on which identity they are actually logged in as. It's something that I play around with in my own, because I have multiple Chrome user profiles. So for a Chrome school and a Google school, it's an expectation that students will have at least one school-related domain profile, but presumably they have another one. And to be able to conduct that experiment for individuals is kind of an interesting experiment. So I think that's what Jackie's response has triggered for me.
Well, I have done a little bit of writing with Michelle in one article around personalized learning, and Jack and I just met a couple weeks ago in a tri-state session. But I think you can see from the two librarians right now, they're constantly iterating and making sense of new ideas, tinkering with existing practice. So like I said, join them as they continue to dive into this. So part of what we'll do is feature their Twitter handles at the bottom of this interview, as well as the two examples, the hashtag example, as well as the bibliography example. So you get a little taste of what we're after as we're describing it, but also to see the definite richness and vitality of the news literacy book. So check it out, and thank you again for joining us, and so much appreciate the conversation.
Thanks, Allison.
Thank you so much, Allison, for having me.